All right. Welcome everyone again. My name is Amanda. I'm the Center Director at Brain Bounce of San Diego. We are a local resource and a program to help families who are struggling with focus, attention, social challenges. It could be reading or comprehension, really a variety of neurodevelopmental disconnections, basically. So social, emotional, academic challenges. And we work with quite a spectrum of students from age 4 to 24 with an adult program on its way. And today we are joined by very special guests, Mr. Thomas Nelson, a local special education attorney who has offered to present for all of you. I know there's a lot of interest today learning more about 504s and IEPs and how to best support your child's education. And so I'm going to let Mr. Nelson introduce himself and kind of get going. Okay.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you for being here this evening, taking time out of your busy schedules, I know. And my goal is just to try to give you some practical tips on how to navigate your child's IEP. If your child isn't on an IEP, how to get the process started. And if your child's on a 504 plan, just some things to watch that maybe your child needs to be on an IEP or maybe not. But we're going to kind of go over an overview of special education rights. And I'm going to try to leave enough time that we can answer some questions at the end. Just as a disclaimer, this isn't intended to be legal advice. I'm speaking, in general terms about principles in the law. If you have, specific questions regarding your child, feel free to reach out to an advocate or an attorney for those questions. And it's a pleasure to be here, Amanda. I actually interviewed her not too long ago for My Special Needs Connection. We have a webinar series with different professionals in the community, including advocates and attorneys and BCBAs, et cetera. So Amanda was gracious enough to give us a presentation very recently. So you can go on their website at www.myspecialneedsconnection.com, and you can actually watch Amanda and her presentation about her business and what she does to help kids with disabilities. And before I get started, I'll just mention that I will be co-presenting with Yoshi Bauer, a special education advocate in the community. Next week, it'll be released on My Special Needs Connection, and it's going to talk about going back to school. Now that schools are reopened, what to watch for in terms of accommodations, in terms of services, in terms of compensatory education, how to address that IEP meeting. And we're also going to be talking about masks and some school districts with mask requirements and some school districts actually excluding kids from the classroom because they're not able to wear a mask. So those are going to be some of the things that are dealt with in that upcoming webinar. And if you just check out My Special Needs Connection, go on their newsletter, you'll be getting a link for the free webinar that'll release next week. So one final point, I am going to be launching a website at the end of summer called IEP Solution. And if you go on iepsolution.com, you can sign up for the newsletter, but it's going to have a lot of free information, free videos for parents. There's going to be live workshops and boot camps and so on and so forth. So I'm excited about that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So I want to talk about eligibility first of all. So how does a child become eligible for an IEP? Well, first of all, they have to have a disabling condition. So whether it's autism or a language impairment or a learning disability, sometimes children with ADD or ADHD might qualify under what's called other health impaired. It could be an orthopedic impairment. You have to have fit into one of those 13 disability categories. Some children fall into more than one, but one is sufficient. That child must also need special education services to benefit from their education. So what does that mean? Well, special education services, or what we call specialized instruction, is where the content, the method, or the delivery of instruction is changed for that particular child's needs. So some children need that. They can't progress as they should in a regular education program. They need some form of changes, whether maybe it's pull out speech and language, or small group instruction for reading or writing or math, or maybe they need behavior services or even emotional services if they have depression or anxiety. So it's changing what normally is provided to the regular education student. Now, how does that differ from a 504 plan? Well, a 504 plan is what's called an accommodation plan. So sometimes when a child has a disability, they might be put on a 504 plan by the school district as opposed to an IEP. If that's done correctly, it means that that child really didn't need the specialized instruction, that change in the content, method of delivery of instruction. All they needed was an accommodation, such as an example might be front row seating, or extra test time, or maybe a peer support or something like that. So you're not really changing the regular education content, you're just adapting or accommodating within that environment for equal access. And that's fine for some children. But I always tell parents, watch and beware, because unfortunately, sometimes there's an incentive for a school district to put a child on a 504 plan when maybe they really need an IEP. The reason is a 504 plan doesn't have the procedural protections. You don't have the annual meetings. You don't have goals and objectives. You don't have procedural protections. You don't have annual reviews. You don't have the requirements regarding assessments. So there's a whole lot more rules the school district has to follow when they put a child on an IEP. So again, just watch it. You can't trust that just because your child has been determined to be 504 eligible and not eligible for an IEP, that's actually correct. In fact, if the 504 plan is not working, if your child isn't, improving or receiving an appropriate education, then maybe you really need to look to the IEP. Just wanted to share the screen. Looks like the share is disabled, Amanda. I don't know if we can, because you're the host. It says host disabled, participant screen sharing. Anyways,
I'm gonna make you host. No, I'm gonna make you host right now. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay. No problem.
Okay, you should be good.
Okay, got it. Perfect. Thank you. So let me just pull up a PowerPoint here. And what I wanted to talk about was what I consider one of the most important rules in special education, and that is your child's program must be individualized. Notice the slides are on the middle and on the left. I was fiddling with it before we got started, and I couldn't seem to make it just the one side appear, so bear with me. But this, I think, is the most important rule in all of special education. And I think every time there's a question about your child's program, you should be thinking in these terms, because so many issues relate to this. Parents walk into an IEP meeting and the district might say, well, this is what we have to offer for children with autism. Or, now that children are back in school, this is what we're doing for all children. Or as compensatory education, what we're going to do is we're going to put your child in ESY, extended school year during the summer. And they're going to be in a group, and they're all going to be, learning essentially kind of the same thing. Well, remember that under the law, the program itself, the IEP program, has to be individualized to meet your child's unique needs. So lawyers often use this analogy. It's the difference between ordering from a cafeteria and cooking from scratch. So for example, in a cafeteria, you might go to the cafeteria and you have a preset selection of a menu. You can't go to the person at the cafeteria and say, hey, I really want this particular dish and I want it cooked this way, or this kind of cheese or whatever. No, you're limited to what's on the cafeteria menu. If, however, you go to the grocery store and buy the ingredients, you're cooking from scratch and you can make pretty much anything you want. It's not pre-selected. You get to choose what to use and how much. So think of education, special education, the same way. The school district really has to, cook from scratch. They have to create a program that meets your child's needs, as opposed to just saying, well, here's our pre-selected program and your child has to fit into that program, as opposed to the other way around. And this is established in the law. So it's not just my opinion, but it's really the way the law works. And this principle carries through everything that happens for your child if your child is on an IEP. So let's talk about how this process works, kind of an overview. There's another attorney in town who put it into these three categories, and I thought that was a pretty good idea, where you have planning, you have process, and you have implementation. So the planning is the planning surrounding the IEP. So how do you plan for this document called the IEP? Well, there are assessments. I'm going to cover these in just a minute, but basically these are the tests, the interviews that the school district uses to determine where the child's unique needs lie. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? How do they learn? And that information is very helpful, of course, in developing this program that's designed to help them achieve progress. So it's used for this IEP, for creating the goals, for determining the services, for figuring out what placement might be appropriate. Then there's the process surrounding the IEP. So what are the procedures that apply to this document? So for example, parent participation is a very important procedure. Basically, the law says that you, the parent, are an equal participant in this IEP meeting. I know a lot of parents don't feel that way sometimes. You go into a meeting and maybe there's 10 other district personnel and you feel outnumbered. And maybe they feel like they're, it appears to you they're in a hurry and they want to get through everything and they don't really want to answer questions. They're rushing through and they just want you to sign it at the end, whether you understood it, you agree with it or not. Well, that's not the way the law was designed. The law was designed so the parent would be an active participant, at least have that opportunity, and an equal participant. That doesn't mean that you can overrule the team's decision, but they have to hear you. They have to be able to answer questions. You have to be able to ask questions and participate and offer suggestions. So the more prepared you are going into this meeting, the more effective you can be as an advocate for your child. And finally is implementation. So you have the planning of this IEP, you have the procedure surrounding the IEP, and then once it's actually agreed upon, it's created, the parent consents to it, the district then has to implement the IEP. In other words, they have to carry it out. It's like a contract, and they have to do what's, the terms that are considered within that document. All three of these things can lead to due process. I mean, that's my specialty, is when there's a breakdown and the parent and the district do not agree and there's no moving forward in the IEP process. And so that due process can really involve any of these. It can involve problems with the planning, problems with the assessments. It can involve problems with the process. The parent wasn't allowed to participate. The parent didn't get their procedural rights or didn't get what's called prior written notice, all the procedures surrounding the IEP, or it could be implementation. The district agreed to give speech language services in the IEP, but there was a time period where the child didn't receive any services whatsoever. Let's talk about the planning. I'm going to stop the share just for a moment. Let's talk about the planning process. So now we're backing up to kind of the beginning. Let's assume that you believe your child needs an IEP. Your child has a disability, and maybe they've been on a 504 plan before, it hasn't really worked, or maybe they've never been on a 504 plan, but you feel that your child might be eligible or might be entitled to an IEP. So how do you get that process started? Well, first of all, I want to mention that the district has a duty to what's called child find. So they have a duty to seek out and find and locate children with disabilities. If the teacher thinks that a child has problems with behaviors or emotions, or maybe, academically, reading or writing, they actually, under the law and the district, are required to start this assessment process if they suspect this child might have a qualifying disability. But you don't necessarily want to wait for that because it may not happen. So you as the parent can start this process. And I'll get to that in just a second. But essentially what you do is you write a letter to the school district requesting your child be assessed for special education services. You put it in writing. It's really important because once you do that, it starts a legal timeline. And what has to happen is within 15 days, the school district has to get back to the parent with an assessment plan. So that plan is basically an outline of the types of assessments the school district is going to conduct. And that's based upon, the information you provided to the district about why you think your child might be eligible for an IEP. Academically, they're suffering, or emotionally, they're having problems, or behaviorally. So that helps the district sort of target the areas of assessment. And they may be talking to the teacher and finding out more information and target areas based upon the teacher's input as well. Once you sign and return that assessment plan, giving them authority or consent to assess, because they don't have that authority just on their own. They have to get authority from you, the parent, or go to due process. But once they get that authority, they have 60 days to complete all their assessments and hold that IEP meeting. So this thing can't drag on forever. There is, a timeline, there is an end date, but you've got to start with that written letter. It's not real complicated. You can just sum it up in one paragraph. My child has real difficulty with reading. He seems to struggle. His vocabulary is really weak. His comprehension is really weak. He has no fluency, whatever it might be. You can put it in layman's terms, but that you want an assessment for special education eligibility. Now, one thing to watch for are SSTs. Probably other school districts call them something else, but locally, that's probably the most common term I've heard. SST standing for Student Study Team. Sometimes what happens when the parent writes this letter is the school district says, well, let's wait on assessments and let's do these SSTs. We'll have an informal meeting with the teacher, maybe the principal, the parent, and see if we can strategize some things in the regular education classroom to help the child. Well, inherently, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but just be aware that that's going to delay the IEP process if you agree to withdraw your request or delay your request for these SSTs. And I've seen it over and over again where the SSTs go on and on and on. I mean, for over a year, and nothing really changes. All that's happened is there's been a delay in the evaluation process. So you don't want to miss time. If your child really should be on an IEP and really should be eligible, you don't want to be delaying the process month by month by month by having these SST meetings held. My feeling is parents typically don't ask for an IEP unless they're really concerned. It's not something that you typically ask for unless there's a reason. So if you feel strong enough that your child is struggling, you probably want to proceed with that IEP. So let's move on to the assessment itself. You've made the request for the assessment. The timeline has started, and now the district is starting the assessment process. So what does that involve? Well, I want to just say that assessments are critical. They're the basis for all good educational planning. And I'm sure Amanda would agree with this. And part of what her company does her agency does is assessments. They also do, obviously, treatment and you know, creating a plan to help the child based upon the assessment. But the assessment is the starting point. And if you have limited information in the assessment, you're probably not going to create a very good plan. So you want to make sure that the assessments are complete and that the child is assessed in every area of need. So if your child has reading difficulties, but also has emotional problems, you don't just want an assessment regarding their academics or reading. You know, you also want that assessment regarding their behaviors or their emotions, because the data that's gathered, the information that's gathered in the assessment is going to translate into this IEP document. And if an area isn't assessed that should be assessed, it's probably not going to find its way into the IEP. And there's probably not going to be services to address that need for the child. So you want to make sure the assessment is complete. So as I mentioned before, they have 60 days to complete the assessment. What happens if the assessment is completed, but the parent doesn't agree with the assessment? Maybe the assessment, you know, finds that ultimately the child's not eligible and the parent thinks the child is eligible. Or maybe the parent doesn't feel like the assessment was complete. It didn't address every area of need. For example, let's say your child has autism and there was an OT assessment and it assessed your child's fine motor skills, you know, using scissors or finger skills, and maybe even gross motor skills, you know, throwing a ball or catching a ball, but didn't assess your child's sensory needs. How are they reacting to their environment in terms of sensory movement or sensory sensitivity, things of that nature. And that is something an OT can assess for. So you didn't feel like that assessment was complete. Well, there's a process called the IEE, or Individual Education Evaluation. And what is that? Well, an IEE is different than a school district assessment. How is it different? Because it's performed by somebody outside of the school. They're not a school district employee. Typically, all of the assessments that are done when you request that special education eligibility are done by the school district personnel, and they have the right to assess. But an IEE is done by somebody outside of the school. And that can be really helpful because unfortunately, sometimes the assessors for the school are kind of operating within a box of options or availability. So for example, if your speech language therapist working for the school district has a caseload of 30 kids and is overwhelmed and overloaded, and now they have a new assessment on another child, you know, it's going to be hard for them to say this child needs a lot of help, a lot of service, when they know that child's going to be on their caseload. It's not to say that happens every time, but you can see what could happen. An independent assessor doesn't care about the district constraints, doesn't care about how many resources the school district has or doesn't have. That's not an issue for the independent assessor, and it's really not an issue for the law. Again, the district has to meet the unique needs of the child, irrespective of what resources they may have available. So it can be really helpful. I mean, even somebody like Amanda could be an independent assessor. And sometimes they have, you know, a special expertise that nobody at the school district has either. So it can be very helpful. So how do you get this independent assessment? Well, there's two ways. You can either just pay for it yourself. You can hire somebody to do an assessment, pay for it yourself, and then bring that assessment to the IEP team and say, here's what my assessor found. We need to discuss this and work this into the IEP. Or you can request the district pay for it. How do you do that? Well, you write a letter disagreeing with their assessment. You don't have to specify all the reasons why, but you disagree with the assessment that was created by the school district, and you ask for this independent assessment at their cost. And at that point, they have two choices, and only two choices. They can either agree to pay for the independent assessment And what'll happen is they'll pay the bill of that independent assessor, and that independent assessor will do the assessment. And then there'll be an IEP meeting where that independent assessor will present his or her results. Or their second option is to file for due process against the parent to defend their assessment. They have the burden of proving that their assessment was appropriate. They only have those two options. There's no third option. There's no third option of just ignoring the parent. There's no third option of saying, no, we're not going to do the independent assessment. They have only two options: either agree and pay for it or file for due process. And, you know, sometimes if it's a close case, they may just agree to pay for it because it's time and effort and trouble for them to fight a case like that. Maybe they have to hire a lawyer to bring the due process complaint, and it's a lot of trouble. So if they think that their assessment might not be appropriate, there's some problems, some holes with it, they might just say, okay, parent, go ahead and get your independent assessment. And again, at that point, the independent assessor will do his or her assessment, and there'll be an IEP meeting scheduled where they'll go over that assessment. So now we've bridged the gap for kind of the planning of the IEP. Now we're going to talk about the next step, which is the actual IEP itself. So what is the standard for an IEP? In other words, how much does the district have to do for the child? Do they have to provide what some people have called a Cadillac program or a Mercedes program, the ultimate for them? Or can they just provide a broken down car, so to speak? How much do they have to provide based upon the law? Well, law is, it has to be a functional program. There was a fairly recent Supreme Court case that I think was helpful for parents. It certainly clarified some of the rights that parents have in terms of an appropriate education for their child. And this is what the language was from the ruling, that an educational program must be appropriately ambitious in light of the child's circumstances. So it can't just be minimal, it can't be just trivial, it's got to be substantive, something that allows your child to pass from grade to grade if they're capable to reach grade level standards. And even if they're not able to do that, it has to be ambitious in light of their unique needs. So just keep that in mind, that I think the law's gotten actually more favorable in that regard. So how do you prepare for an IEP? Well, gather records. If you have assessments of your child, independent assessments, read through them, just familiarize yourself. If it's a new IEP, try to get the assessments before the IEP. It's really hard to show up at the IEP with a big stack of assessments from the speech person, the psychologist, the school, the resource teacher, and try to digest all that as the meeting's going on. So ask for the records ahead of the meeting. So tell them, you need the records so you can be prepared at the meeting. Review, past IEPs if there are past. See if if your child's making progress and if you think the goals that have been drafted in previous IEPs have been met. And think about changes that you would like. If there's some things that you think are working or things that you think aren't working or some changes that might be helpful for your child, come prepared with those, because as I mentioned before, they have to allow you to participate. And finally, I say tape record. If you give at least 24-hour notice before the meeting that you are going to tape record, that is your legal right. And it's, I think, really important. It frees you up to listen and ask questions. You don't have to be taking notes and figuring out everything that everybody's saying. There's a record there. And if there's ever a problem in the future as to what was said and what was agreed to, you have a tape of that meeting. It's not a big deal. It's not like the district's going to look at you funny or think that you're litigious or anything like that. Parents do it all the time. And trust me, after 5 minutes, they'll forget the tape recorder's even on. I've seen it over and over again. I'm like, they said that when the tape recorder was going, but they forget, so it's, again, I think it's important, but it's it's not a big deal, I think, from the district's perspective. So some important components in the IEP are the present levels or baselines. So that's kind of the current functioning of your child, whether it's in academics, reading, writing, or math. Make sure it's accurate in the IEP, because that's going to be the starting point for the goal. The goal is what we want our child to be able to do in 1 year. So you got to have that present level or baseline correct, because if it's too low, then the goals are probably going to be too low. If it's too high, then the goal's probably not going to be reasonable. So, you know, as best as you can, try to ensure that those present levels of your child's behavior, reading, writing, math, emotional control, etc., are accurate. So those are called the present levels or the baselines. And that's the springboard for the goals. That's the next major component, our goals and objectives. And so these are the written in every area of need that a child may have. So make sure there are goals in every area of need. How do you know where the areas of need are? Again, go back to the assessments. The assessments are going to identify your child's strengths and weaknesses. But wherever there's an area of need, there should be a goal written. And sometimes even within an area of need, you might need multiple goals. If, for example, a child has weakness in reading, they're weak in fluency, and they're weak in comprehension, maybe there should be a goal for each. I would argue there should be a goal for each reading deficiency or weakness, because they're targeting different things, and you need instruction in different ways, and you need to track the progress for each particular component. And make sure they're specific. It should be so specific that a person who doesn't know your child could pick up the IEP, read the goal, and understand what the goal says, what it means. So, you know, they need to avoid generalities, you know, according to, you know, teacher observations or opinions, without specifying what it is the child should be able to do in 1 year. So make sure it's tight, because it's to your advantage that the goal is specific enough that you know whether it's been met or not met. The goals then drive services. So the areas of your child's need to be in goals, and whatever those goals, you know, dictate, drive the services. So if your child is weak in language, it's going to drive speech language services. Weak in academics, it's going to drive, you know, some specialized academic instruction. Or weak in emotional control or behavior, maybe school counseling, or even maybe mental health services. So those services should be attached to the goals. How is the child going to reach that goal in 1 year? Well, you need the service. A goal in itself isn't going to do any good. You need the service attached to the goal. And then finally, the last thing the district should be talking about is placement. Not the first thing. You know, they shouldn't start the meeting by saying, well, your child has autism, so they're going to a special day class. Now let's talk about goals and let's talk about services. No, you talk about the goals, you talk about the services, then you look at the placement. And the placement is, where is this all going to happen? Is it going to happen in general education with maybe some pull-out help, meaning taken out of the classroom into a small group for certain instruction where the child might have some weaknesses? Or is it going to be what we call push-in, where the special education person comes into the classroom and assists the child in their areas of need? Or are they going to be in a special day class where most of their education is with special education students, and part of their day might be with regular education peers? Whatever that placement is, the district always has to consider what's called the least restrictive environment. And what that means is the most exposure to non-disabled peers as is appropriate. So the regular education classroom is always the preferred placement. Doesn't always work that that's the appropriate placement. Some children need a more restrictive setting than the regular education environment to receive an appropriate education. but that's kind of the starting point. That's what should be considered first. Unfortunately, sometimes I talked about individualized versus, what's convenient to the district. Sometimes this is where you see it happen. A child might have autism, let's say, and is in the 2nd grade, and there's a special day class for kids with autism. Well, rather than trying to work with the general education 1st grade or 2nd grade or kindergarten and create accommodations or services within that placement, they just automatically put the child in a special day class. Well, that might not be the least restrictive environment for that child, because if that child could be successful in the general education setting with aids and supports, that's where they need to be. That is the least restrictive environment. They only should be moved to a special day class or a more restrictive environment if without aids and supports, they can't be successful. That is true of some children. They can't be successful in general education environment for most of their day, even if they have the support of a one-on-one aid or a behavior plan or things of that nature. But there are children who unfortunately get moved to a special day class when, if they'd had that one-on-one aid, if they'd had that behavior plan in general education, they could have been successful, and the law would support that. That would be the least restrictive environment. Just a few more points before I wrap up. What about reviewing and revising the IEP? Well, first of all, you can call an IEP at any time. You send a letter to the district requesting an IEP. That's probably a good idea to just mention briefly what the reason is. But once you do that, they have to hold the IEP within 30 days. So let's say that you noticed your child's behavior is getting much worse than when you met as a team, say 8 months ago or 10 months ago. I mean, maybe behavior was noticed, maybe there's one goal on the IEP, but it wasn't really a big deal. But now you're getting calls day after day after day from, the teacher, from the assistant principal, your child's being sent to the office, and all of these things are going on. And you're thinking to yourself, this is different than when we last met. And I don't think we addressed this. Well, that's a great time to call an IEP, because the team can now review the current information and adjust the IEP accordingly. You don't have to wait a year, even though the IEP is an annual document. It can be modified and changed before that year is up. And sometimes it's a great idea to do so, especially when it comes to behavior. I mean, you don't want 6 months of bad behavior going on and not being addressed by the team and not being addressed by correct programming. Imagine what that could lead to. So remember that if you're having doubts about the IEP, if you think there's areas that need to be addressed that weren't addressed, call for an IEP and discuss those issues. And it could even be just a lack of expected progress. It doesn't have to be anything, as extreme as maybe behavior situation, but you just don't think your child's progressing. The program doesn't seem to be working. That might be another reason. Or maybe you get an independent assessment and you find out new information. Great time to call an IEP. And so other than that, it's done on an annual basis, and the assessments are done on a triennial basis every 3 years. But as I mentioned, with the IEP, you can also ask for assessments before that 3-year period is up. If your child, let's go back to the behavior issue, your child's having behavior problems, you can say, let's call an IEP meeting. You go to the IEP and you say, what, I think we need to start some assessments for my child's behavior. We didn't really see it the last triennial, which was 2 years ago, but now we see it and we need to explore it and we need to program for it. And again, the starting point is assessments. The last topic before we get to kind of the conclusion is just returning to school. Again, every school or school district is going to look a little different. Some are hybrid, some are full-time, some, are not. The programming is going to be different, but keep in mind always that the program has to be individualized for your child's unique needs. So, don't take this, well, this is what we do for all kids now that they're coming back. Make sure the IEP is addressed for your child's unique needs. Again, I'm going to be covering this in more detail with Yoshi Bauer. We'll be releasing that next week, and we're going to talk about mask policies and kids that can't wear masks and how that impacts, the school district's response. So what is it that I do as a lawyer? Well, I basically file for due process. I file the due process complaints. I typically don't get involved at the IEP level, although I may coach a parent in just what they should do in anticipation of problems. I always encourage parents to try to work it out. If they haven't had an IEP meeting over a disagreement, call one, try to work it out. You always want to do that first. But if you can't work it out, that's the remedy that's available. It's called due process. And that could be a disagreement regarding the planning, the assessments, what's in the IEP, the present levels, the goals, the services, the placement. It could be the process of the IEP, violating the rules such as parental participation, consent, notice, the timelines, and it could be the implementation, that the district failed to implement the document after it was written. So what can you get from due process? Well, the most common remedies are independent assessments, an order that the district has to pay for outside assessments, compensatory education, which is basically makeup services for the loss. Give you a quick example. Let's say that the child didn't get speech language services for 2 months. They were supposed to get half an hour a week. Well, the school district may be ordered to make up for that service by paying a private provider to give the child those same hours or sufficient hours to make up for that loss. And that could be done after school. It could be done during breaks. It's not supposed to be in lieu of or a part of the child's regular program, because then you're taking away something to give something, but something afterwards. And it's typically done through a private agency. It could be tutoring for educational loss, and the district has to pay for it. It could be reimbursement for services. So maybe the parent had to go out and pay for tutoring or had to pay for speech language services, or in some circumstances even paid for a private school program because the district wasn't offering something appropriate. And finally, legal expenses. Under the law, if the parent prevails in a due process complaint, either through a resolution or through a judge's order, the district often either agrees or is compelled to pay for the parent's attorney's fees. So in some ways, it can sometimes be affordable to parents to hire a lawyer, because the lawyer may say, look, I think this is a case we can win, and therefore, instead of charging you, the parent, I'm going to charge the district for my fees because I think we're going to prevail in the matter. So one last thing about back to school is Governor Newsom did, issue a guideline months back where he mentioned that, compensatory education is a topic of discussion when children, return back to school, because there have been a lot of children who have actually regressed as a result of distance learning. Some children haven't. Some children have actually done okay, but some children just haven't been able to access their education through distance learning at all for various reasons, and including their disability. So that's why there is that guideline that compensatory education is a topic of discussion at the IEP team level. And if you've documented your child's regression, that might be a real good reason to get that tutoring, that compensatory education to make up for any loss. So that's the sum of my overview. I know we covered a lot in a short period of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have and take as much time as we need.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. That was
Sure.
great.
Yeah,
I always learn something new with you, and I hope a
good.
lot of you parents were able to take away a lot of notes as well. We did get a few questions, so while
Sure.
everyone's kind of processing all the information, feel free to type into the chat box as well, or you can, do the little raise hand and we can unmute you and you can ask too. That's easier. Number one, how early can IEPs or 504 plans start? Can they be as early as 3 years old in preschool or TK or kindergarten?
Sure. Yeah, it's under the law, it's when the child turns 3, the IEP should be in effect. So typically, like in California, you have regional center, services before the child turns 3.
Mhm.
But once that child, turns 3, basically the school district takes over at least the educational component of the child's needs. So you want to make sure that, the assessment process starts before the child turns 3, because you want that IEP to be in place when the child turns 3. I mean, sometimes, regional center and the school districts will be in communication, but, double check on that and make sure, because you want, the school district to do its assessment so it can make an offer through an IEP on your child's 3rd birthday.
So kind of sum that up, get that process started. You don't have to
Yeah,
wait to get the process
right.
started. And then you mentioned the San Diego Regional Center. Do you mind just sharing a little bit about what that is? I find that a lot of the parents that come through my program have never heard of the Regional Center.
Well, it's basically, an organization that's set up to help children, before 3 with their disability needs. Sometimes it could be speech language. It could even be respite for the parents. It could be occupational therapy. But once, an IEP, once a child turns 3, then at least the school district sort of takes care of the educational part. But the regional center can still be involved for things that are not educationally related, like the home life. And in fact, when a child then becomes an adult, regional center can still be a resource. So yeah, I mean, you have to qualify for regional center services, but if your child has a disability, there's a process you go through. But I mean, generally, I think I haven't heard of a lot of pushback by regional center. I mean, sometimes I've heard of cases where they denied eligibility, but if your child has a diagnosis of, say, autism or Down syndrome or something like that, it's pretty perfunctory. I mean, it's pretty straightforward to get regional center services. So definitely look into that.
Yeah, so if anyone hasn't heard of it, if your child has a diagnosis or needs, additional services, San Diego Regional Center provides support from essentially birth into even adulthood. With they kind of manage the state funds for these services. So definitely look into it. And for us, we always encourage folks to look into self determination funds to afford programs like ours, because a lot of companies, I should say, are starting to realize the medical route is not always the best route. And so this bucket of money at the regional center is really unique and new. And I definitely encourage you to explore it. It is not necessarily easy to get, but it is an option. But in general, check it out if you haven't. Okay. All right. So the next question is, what kind of help can kids with ADHD get from school?
Well, I've seen children with ADHD on 504 plans. I've seen children with ADHD on IEPs. And for me, it's more really a matter of degree. So if a child has let's say a mild ADD or a mild ADHD, it's possible they don't need an IEP. Maybe they don't need specialized instruction. They just need some accommodation. So for example, child with very mild ADD might just need front row seating or extra test time. And that might be sufficient, and they can progress and do everything they need to do in their education. But take the next child who has more moderate or even severe ADD or ADHD. And in a classroom of 28 kids, even if they're sitting in the front row, the distractions, the noise, the talking, the movement, they just can't pay attention long enough to really learn. So that child probably needs an IEP, and maybe for their areas, of weakness, they should go into a small group setting. It's very, it's not, something that's ostracizes the child or anything like that. It's just they get pulled out of the classroom some point during the day and they go into a small group, and there's a special education teacher there sitting with 2, 3, 4, 5 kids and giving them instruction in a small group. And those children can thrive in that kind of setting because they don't have all the distractions, and it's more closely to one-on-one, and they can have their questions answered, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one example. It could be behavior issues. Kids with ADHD sometimes have behavior problems, not always, but sometimes they do because they might be very impulsive. So, maybe that child needs a behavior plan. First of all, so the school understands the disability and they're not being punished all the time because of their impulsivity. They're actually, there's a plan to help them and to reduce those types of impulsive behaviors. And maybe there's counseling. So there are a lot of things that can be done, for those kids, both academically and behaviorally, to try to help them in the educational setting. And again, the worst thing is if the school doesn't recognize their problem, doesn't understand it. I mean, they can be falling further behind, and they might be super smart kids, but then they start feeling dumb about themselves because academically they're not measuring up, or maybe their impulsivity, or their impulsivity is getting them in trouble all the time, and the teacher doesn't like them, and so on. So because nobody understands their disability. So I think it's really important to get that addressed.
Definitely. And just to add on a little bit, we work with a lot of kids with attention and focus and ADHD challenges. And we see it all just like what Mr. Nelson just shared, from something as simple as front row seating or extended time in tests, to pull out, or small group work, and even support with executive functioning. The executive functioning deficits are highly associated with kids with ADHD. And so getting training for that and supports and graphic organizers, etc. There's a whole list of supports you can get. And if you're interested in learning more, I can support you with that as well.
Great.
So that answered the question.
Sure.
Okay. Erica had her hand raised. Let's do that. And I would bounce back to the questions in the chat box. So Erica, let me unmute you, or I think you have to unmute Erica.
Okay.
Since you are now the host again.
Oh, okay.
Hopefully you can find her. She has her hand raised.
Is Erica with E-R?
E-R-I-K-A, last name P-U-R-K-I-S-E-R.
I'm sorry, there was a couple people that joined. Now I realize I'm the host again. We've kind of
I know.
out.
I didn't want to interrupt you once I came privileges. I felt bad because I knew I wasn't going to be able to admit anybody. Yeah. So I'm sure there were quite a few who kind of left because they weren't admitted, and that's okay,
Sure,
kind of
sure.
Get started.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I'm looking for Erica. It's spelled
E-R-I-K-A.
There we are. Okay, so let's see. Ask to unmute. There we go. I just
there you go.
Ask her to unmute. There we
go. Hi.
Hello.
Okay, so my son is in 5th grade, and I've been pushing, knowing for years that something was up. Anyway, I finally got him an IEP just barely at the end of last year.
Okay.
So that nothing really happened because COVID hit. And
sure.
So, and then this year they started it. But then I finally just went ahead and had him tested at Rady's Children's, and he ended up having being diagnosed with autism level 1. So I went back, and it was by then already time to do the new IEP, the 1-year mark.
Mm-hmm.
And they added another hour. So they're doing 3 times 30 minutes. He's just getting, well, first of all, they never mentioned that should I be compensated? That was a really hefty assessment, even after insurance, we're still out thousands of dollars for that. So I don't know, do I go back and ask for compensation for that?
Is that your question?
That is my question. I mean, I have
Sure.
several, which I don't know if I have time for all of them. I have like 3, but
Sure. Okay. Well, I mean, as I mentioned before, there's the process of the independent educational evaluation. You know, if you've ever already gotten the evaluation done, you know, it can be a little bit trickier maybe to get reimbursement for the cost. I think, you know, you might need to show that there was some reason. I assume they didn't assess for autism when they did their assessment, correct?
no, they did not.
Okay, well, the question becomes, was there something that they missed? Was there something in the school setting where they should have seen indicators of autism? So for example, poor social skills or sensory seeking behaviors that they just missed and they shouldn't have missed, and they should have done an assessment for autism, because ultimately that probably would have affected the programming in the IEP itself. So yeah, I mean, you know, it's hard for me to give you a definitive answer on whether you could receive reimbursement for the cost, or even comp ed possibly, because they didn't assess for autism. So for the programming didn't include autism, and maybe it should have. But I think, again, it really depends on what they knew or should have known. You know, what was your child exhibiting? Obviously, it's been hard with COVID because, you know, the degree of what they can see or not see is somewhat limited. But let's go back before COVID and what they saw in the classroom at that time. Should they have assessed for autism?
Yeah, they weren't noticing anything. I think it's just
Well, they
it's my
say they,
child. I know.
yeah, I mean, they say they didn't notice anything, but, you know, sometimes the records
Right.
show differently. So it's a matter of proof. Anything that, you know, lawyers get involved, we have to prove things, and we prove that through information. That could be through, you know, information from the teacher, information from different participants in the school, information from the parent, or through documentation. You know, did the documents show things that would have made them aware of these concerns?
So how do I bring that up? Like, do I, the principal or the psychologist, or?
Well, you can bring it up in an IEP meeting, you know, that
Mhm.
here's the new assessment. It shows he has autism. First of all, we need to program around autism, or at least you need to assess for it. And in fact, I think you guys should be paying for my assessment because you guys didn't even assess this area, and I had to go out and do it. So, you know, chances are the district's probably going to tell you they want to assess on their own.
Yeah.
Again, you know, probably would have been a little more straightforward if
Yeah.
you had known about the IEE process
Right.
and written them a letter and say, I disagree with your assessment. I want to get an IEE at your expense. And then they didn't, you know, file for due process, and then you get your assessment paid for. But, you know, there still is a remedy, but, you know, it's hard for me to say whether you would prevail or not. Again, I think it goes back to what they knew or should have known.
Well, and for these kids, I feel like they need more than help inside the at school. It's like there's so much I'm trying to do after school, you know, he needs tutoring, he needs help with, he's so far behind. And if I didn't stay with him on his homework every night, there's no way he would get any of it done. And he's in tears. We're in tears every other night, and he misses so much class time, and then he's lost. And does the IEE, does that compensate for the, you know, after school tutoring and the?
Well, that's a different question. You would have to show that their program wasn't appropriate to get the after school program, and that he wasn't getting the help that he needed. Again, that gets a little bit challenging when we're talking about distance learning because it is different. But,
Uh-huh.
This actually leads into a couple other questions. Erica, if you don't mind putting yourself back on mute, if we have time, we'll come back to your
Sure.
other questions.
Okay.
But you mentioned documentation. And so someone asked, you know, what's acceptable proof to document that regression that you were speaking of to show to the district?
Well, it doesn't really have to be very formal. So, you know, way early on back in April, May, June of 2020, I was telling parents to take notes.
Yep, that's what
So
I said.
when your child went on Zoom, for an hour or 45 minutes, how much of that time were they actually paying attention? Or how much of that time did they walk away? Or did they start fiddling, with, their hair or their clothes or something else? When your child was supposed to get half an hour of speech a week,
Yep.
did that speech person actually zoom in, every week? And for how long? Or were they just part of the general ed or the special education classroom and didn't really meet with your child individually? So all of those things, it's remember, during COVID and distance learning, that one of the funny things about it is, you, the parent, become the best observer of your child. I mean, it used to be, when your child was in school, a lot of times you didn't know what was going on. Were they getting the services they were supposed to get? Were their needs being addressed in the classroom? What kind of instruction were they getting? So to some degree, you're kind of at a loss, but now it's switched to you, you're kind of the primary person who's involved. That's not easy, but you had a unique position to know what your child's getting or not getting. And as long as you kept track of that, that's all you need. You don't have to have it sworn by a notary. It's just, hopefully you kept some notes or some documents and you can speak to what was, what happened. But even let's assume you didn't, if your child regressed in certain areas, I mean, that might be enough. You don't even necessarily have to show that, your child didn't access the full program for these dates and these times. Maybe it's just a matter of showing this is where my child was a year ago, and now he's lost whatever he had a year ago. He's back to a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. And that's regression. And that might be enough for compensatory education.
I did another workshop that talked a lot about this and documenting with another presenter as well. And so if anybody's interested in just a really simple document that was created, I can share that with you after this presentation. Just reach out to me and let me know. Again, like Mr. Nelson said, if you can document those notes, anything that you're seeing, are they meeting with the folks they're supposed to be meeting with, where are their levels in reading, math, etc. Right? Anything you want to note, you should note. And I'm personally a fan of documentation because it helps you keep track of what's going on. It's really hard to remember what happened yesterday, right? Let alone 2 months ago or 6 months ago. And if you have multiple children, your own lives to balance, it gets confusing. And so rather than having this emotional, like, I think this is happening, you can show yourself and others that this is in fact the regression that is occurring and not just something that's in my head, right? So
sure. Yeah, and I'll mention too, my special needs connection did a couple of webinars on COVID and documentation and compensatory education. So yeah, there's some resources out there. That's great, Amanda, that you have that resource as well.
Yeah, for sure. And then you kind of touched on this, so about the after school tutoring program. So someone currently is paying for tutoring services. Would they qualify for reimbursement? What do you need to retain an attorney for that? Just what is your advice there?
Well, I mean, parents can get tutoring for different reasons. So it really, like most answers, it depends. Let's assume that a district's providing an appropriate program, but it's not the Cadillac, it's not the Mercedes. A parent might want to supplement that program, and they're certainly entitled to do that and pay for outside tutoring. In that situation, the district wouldn't be responsible for paying for it because it was the parent who chose to get something beyond, what was quote unquote appropriate by the school district. In the next situation, let's assume the school district didn't offer what was appropriate. There wasn't enough help. There wasn't enough service, or it was the wrong kind of service, or that service was just completely left off. In that situation, that could be a denial of FAPE, a denial of a free appropriate public education, of which one remedy might be, as I mentioned earlier, reimbursement. So it really all hinges on the district's program. Was it FAPE? Then you won't get reimbursement. If it wasn't FAPE, you might very well be entitled to reimbursement. So, that's where the answer lies. Do you need a lawyer for that? Well, I think it can be helpful because sometimes in an IEP meeting, the parent might ask for things and the team is just not really prepared. to answer or give authority for certain things. But in due process, we don't deal with the IEP team, we deal with, maybe the director of special education, maybe their lawyer or a representative of due process, and in a very small group. And they're aware of the rules that apply. And so they're looking at the situation more objectively. And I think, understanding if they lose, they're going to have to pay me for every hour that I spend on the case, because if they lose, they have to pay reasonable attorney's fees. So oftentimes they want to get out of the case as quickly as possible if they know that they're going to lose the case. And so when I look at a case, I look at it very carefully and determine whether I think we're going to prevail or not. And if we are, oftentimes we can settle pretty quickly and we can get reimbursement or we can get tutoring and things of that nature. But again, the foundation is showing the district denied FAPE.
Great. Okay, and then there was another question. Can you repeat what you're saying about general education with aids and supports and not special day class right away? Just that you talked about.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's called the least restrictive environment, which is kind of why special education came into effect in the first place, because historically children with special needs were being isolated and excluded from general education students. They had their own special schools and they never integrated. So this law came into effect, and it's probably one of the biggest, what would you say, driving forces in the law is we want children with disabilities to be educated with children with disabilities. They can learn from them and model, them, and they're going to live in a society that involves, adults that maybe don't have disabilities. They've got to learn to work together now, and they can benefit from that. And the general ed population can benefit as well, because they're going to be living in a world with disabled adults. So Congress saw that as a really positive thing. So that's why the law and the rule exists. And as I mentioned before, a child should not be moved from the regular education setting to a special day class, which again, by definition, special day classes, most of your day is in special education, unless it can be shown that even with the use of aids and supports, that child can't be successful in general education. So, make sure the district isn't missing something like, well, gosh, yeah, he's got bad behavior, but you guys never created a behavior plan. You never tried to address the behavior in regular education. The behavior wasn't so bad that they had to just be moved to a special day class automatically. Or, yeah, maybe they had some attention problems and maybe they kind of wander in classroom, but did you ever try a one-on-one aid? Maybe that aid could help them attend and help them participate and help them to focus and help them to learn in the regular education setting. So particularly younger students, I think LRE is just huge. So, if they move a kindergarten or first grader to a special day class, sometimes they can do it legitimately and legally, but it kind of calls into question, because what did they really try before they made that move?
Great. I don't see any new questions in the chat box. So I'll give folks another 5 or so minutes to write any new questions. Erica, well, actually, before we get to Erica, for those who either are just joining us or kind of wrapping up here, I will be following up with everyone. Mr. Nelson, is it okay to share your contact information with everyone?
Oh, absolutely, of course.
Great. So I put in our email, I corrected it, I apologize. If you have questions for me before I reach out to you, you can contact us at sandiego@brainbalancecenters.com. But again, I'll reach out to everyone and send out an email and have Mr. Nelson's contact information there as well. And let's see. Okay.
And I'm happy to just guide you too. I mean, I answer the phone, and sometimes parents just need a little guidance. They don't need a lawyer today.
Exactly.
Maybe they just need to call an IEP meeting, but I can kind of guide them through the process and the questions that need to be asked. And if things don't work out, they may call me back. So, yeah.
Mr. Nelson's my go-to for that. I'm like, and same here at Brain Balance. Maybe you don't need our services now, but you're curious and you just need a little advice. A lot of folks come to us just either for the assessment, just to have some more information to work with, or, you know, other advice like these little documents or documents for documenting or advice about ADHD and what kind of services can you get as part of our assessment. You know, I do a lot of school meetings as well. So oftentimes parents don't know what kind of services they're even able to get it when their child has this challenge, you know. So, you know, you don't know what you don't know. So the more resources, the better. Props to every single one of you for committing and joining us today and being with us tonight. If you have to go, that's totally fine. Again, we'll be contacting you, but I want to answer a few more questions. So Erica, if you want to unmute Erica another time again. Yeah.
I also had a question about the, I recently saw a flyer on the EASY program, extended school year. And I wasn't sure if that was something you have to pay for, if it's free, or if it's free for IEP students, or what that program, if you've heard of it.
I haven't. I've heard generally that some school districts are offering ESY as compensatory education. And my feeling is, you know, you need to really define what that is in the IEP meeting, because again, it needs to meet your child's unique needs and whatever deficiencies or regression they've suffered. So, you know, who's doing it, how many kids are in the classroom, how are they going to know what to do, things of that nature. But I have not heard of that program.
Okay, thank you.
If it's what I'm thinking, I just saw some flyers about it as well, just support for the summer because of the COVID slide or summer slide. One of the flyers I saw, you have to apply for it. It's not something you just get. And one of the flyers I saw, the deadline was on the 30th, but I don't think it hurts to look into it more and just, you know, try to apply if it's something that you think would be beneficial to your child.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else have any other questions before we end the night? I know it takes. Oh, I see. Oh, go ahead, Alma.
Yes, during this pandemic, I have 50 losses. My direct family passed away, and I postponed the IP meetings with the school. And my question is, what consequences can I have to postpone the IP meetings?
So I think I heard you said you unfortunately missed your meeting with the school. Is that correct?
No, I lost 50 family members from my family.
You lost family members? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm
So
sorry.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I postponed my IP meetings with the school during COVID
Okay.
pandemic.
Okay, you postponed the meeting during COVID?
Yes, and
Okay.
my question is, what consequences can I have for the school to point to us?
I didn't really catch the last part of your question. So you postponed the meetings. Are they coming up now?
Yes, we set up an IP meeting, but I'm scared. I'm very worried if they point fingers to me because I postponed the IP
Okay.
meeting.
I think I know what she's saying. Do you know, Mr. Nelson?
Are you fearful that because you postponed the meeting, what might happen?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, you obviously had a very good reason to postpone the meeting. Goodness, I mean, that's as good a reason as any I could imagine. So there's no consequence to postponing the meeting. I would just say, you know, if you can go forward with the meeting now, go forward with it.
Yeah, I think the only consequence is that it takes longer for you to implement whatever was on the IEP or any changes.
Right.
That's the only consequence.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only consequence is that maybe, you know, your son or daughter didn't get the program that maybe they needed because of the delay. But no, it's not a problem from the school's point of view.
Yes, my son is very successful in regular and the general education class, science and math, but he's 5 years reading skills behind. So that's just my concern. So I don't know how to request to the school, how to request a help for remediation for 5 years in reading.
Sure. Well, one possibility is to contact an advocate to go with you to this meeting, to address the issue of your son being behind in reading and what can the team do, to make up for that. And if you sent me an email, I could give you some names of some folks in town, or you could go to the meeting yourself and just ask that very question. What are you guys going to do? My son is so far behind in reading. Academically, he's fine in other areas, but he's way behind in reading, and we need to get him caught up. What do you have to offer? I would definitely, tell them you're going to tape record at least 24 hours before the meeting and bring that tape recorder and tape record the meeting, and let's see what they say. But that's a definite concern, and reading is, as you know, very important, and you don't want that to slip away.
Thank you so much, Lola.
Sure.
I'll give it just a couple more minutes. We are wrapping up here, coming up on 8 o'clock, but I do see quite a few folks still on. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask, you can also private message me if you didn't know, and I can ask that question anonymously. If you don't want to share it with everyone, that's not a problem as well. And Tom, you are getting some thank yous.
Oh, great. Well, it's my pleasure.
I'll give folks, like I said, just another minute or so, see if anybody else has anything else to say, or private message. Tom, I'm impressed. No water. I'm constantly drinking water.
Oh, I'm thirsty. I just didn't have any close by, but I'm okay. Oh, yeah, I'm not gonna fall over.
All right. Well, I don't see anything else coming in from anybody. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm proud of you. You're doing the best you can. And just remember that everyone, you're doing the best you can with what you have. So right now you're here learning more with Mr. Nelson, and Brain Balance San Diego is also here for you as well. Your school hopefully is there for you. So it's a team effort. Don't feel like you're doing everything by yourself. We at Brain Balance host quite a few workshops throughout the year, definitely usually once a month. So stay tuned. Our next event, by the way, is a big anniversary party next Saturday, May 15th. So I'll be sending out information about that as well. And you can come and celebrate and just be amongst people again. It's kind of nice. But otherwise.
It's in person?
In person, yes.
Yay.
Yes, in person. So I look forward to following up with everyone. Mr. Nelson, have fun on your trip to Catalina. We do have a hand raised. Alma, did you want to ask one more question? Go ahead. Oh, I think that's a clap.
Oh.
I'm confusing the clap from the hand raise. Oh yeah, the celebration. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm learning. But have fun on your trip to Catalina. I appreciate all of it.
Yeah, I did receive a chat note about someone would like to email me some questions. So I think that was for me. Maybe it was for you. I'm not sure. But at any rate, if you...
We're going to all exchange information. So.
Yeah, exactly. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording now. Have a good night, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Good night.